When I opened my front door that afternoon, the kind of afternoon when you expect nothing unusual and suddenly everything shifts, I saw the two faces I had trained myself to forget for 15 years. My name is Quinn Foster, and the life I built was never meant to cross paths with the people standing at my gate. I had spent years believing distance would be enough to keep old wounds quiet. Yet the moment I heard my name spoken in voices I once feared, something inside me tightened in a way I had not felt since I was a child. My parents stood there with the kind of hesitant confidence that suggested they believed they still had a place in my life. Before I could decide whether to close the door or confront the moment they stepped closer and offered a line, they must have rehearsed during the drive, a line that cut through me with the weight of the past they pretended not to remember. They said, "We're still family, aren't we?" I felt the air in my chest stall. Their question pulled me back to a memory I had spent years locking away, a memory from when I was 12, and heard words that ended my childhood in a single moment. I looked at them not with anger, but with clarity that had taken half my life to build, and I answered exactly as the truth demanded. I said, "Family, who are you?" They froze as if they never imagined the past would rise between us so sharply. What they did not understand was that everything began the day they left me alone at a bus station in Portland and told me to grow up on my own. If you want to hear how a 12-year-old became someone her own parents could not recognize, stay with me and make sure you subscribe so you do not miss what happened next. Many years earlier, when I was still learning how to read people more than books, I realized that silence inside our home carried a weight that felt heavier than raised voices. My parents, Jeffrey and Dawn, handled disappointment with an icy composure that could stretch across an entire evening without breaking, and I grew up sensing every shift in the air long before anyone spoke. My sister Meredith learned to navigate that tension effortlessly, because nothing she did ever seemed to trigger it. I learned the opposite lesson. At that time, I had already figured out that Jeffrey expected results, not effort, and he never hid the impatience in his voice. Whenever he looked over school papers I tried to bring to him, Dawn rarely contradicted him. Instead, she sat at the end of the table with a closed expression that suggested she had already accepted whatever judgment he would deliver. Whenever Meredith walked into the room, she carried an ease that softened him. Whenever I entered, his posture changed in a way that made me stand a little smaller. One evening stands out more clearly than the others. We were sitting at the dining table, and Jeffrey had placed one of my graded assignments between us. The red marks looked worse under the bright kitchen lights, and he tapped his finger on the paper as if every mark confirmed what he already believed. He asked why I could not meet expectations that he considered basic, and his tone carried no curiosity, only irritation. Meredith lingered in the doorway for a moment, probably sensing the atmosphere, then stepped back without saying anything. Dawn folded her napkin slowly and asked whether I had followed the study plan she had written earlier in the week. I told her I had tried, and Jeffrey interrupted to question what the word tried even meant for me. None of this ever turned into shouting. That was the strange part. There were no slammed doors or raised voices. There was only Jeffrey's calm disappointment and Dawn's quiet agreement, and somehow that felt sharper than anything they could have yelled. I kept thinking that maybe if I explained myself clearly enough, they would understand that I was doing my best. But the more I tried to explain, the more their expressions tightened, as if I was confirming a suspicion they already held about me. Meredith thrived in this environment not because she asked for special treatment, but because she fit seamlessly into the version of family life that Jeffrey admired. She excelled at her schoolwork and returned home with certificates she never boasted about yet. The simple act of handing them to him created a warmth I had never experienced firsthand. Dawn offered her encouragement that felt genuine, but when she turned to me, the warmth faded as if she did not know how to direct it towards someone who did not naturally meet expectations. There was a Saturday morning that marked a turning point. Jeffrey had planned a family outing and asked Meredith to help organize the schedule. I stepped into the living room holding a flyer from a weekend workshop I hoped they would allow me to join something that might help me strengthen the subjects I struggled with. I waited until Jeffrey finished his conversation with her, then approached with the flyer. He looked at it for a long moment before asking why I wanted to participate in something he believed I would not follow through on. Meredith shifted uncomfortably and suggested that attending the workshop might help me. Jeffrey dismissed the idea with a brief remark about limited time and priorities. Dawn stepped in only to say that the schedule was already full. The dismissal was swift, and the conversation moved on without me. I stood there holding the flyer that suddenly felt heavier than a single sheet of paper, and something inside me settled into place. I understood that morning that I was not part of the picture they imagined when they planned anything together. It was not anger that I felt, only a quiet recognition that home was not the place where I would ever be understood the way Meredith was. On an early summer morning, a shift in the atmosphere inside our home arrived, with a quiet certainty that I felt long before anyone spoke. Meredith had received an email from her school announcing that she had been selected for a regional academic program, one that only a small group of students ever reached. She read the message aloud at the table with the same calm confidence she carried into every room. Dad congratulated her in a tone that held pride so clear it settled over everything. Mom touched her shoulder with a gentle approval that showed how naturally Meredith fit into the expectations they valued. The moment was still unfolding when Dad turned toward me with a look that asked a question he did not bother to phrase out loud. He glanced at the folder holding my end-of-year results and remarked that progress should never move backward. I knew he expected a response, but every word I considered seemed inadequate. Meredith tried to redirect the conversation by asking about the summer plans, and, for a moment, I hoped it would ease the pressure building in the room. Mom suggested a short trip to Portland as a way for everyone to reset before the next school term. She framed it as an opportunity to clear our minds after months of schedules and expectations. Dad agreed without hesitation. I sensed something unspoken between them, although I could not understand what it might be. I simply nodded because disagreeing never changed their decisions. Meredith seemed excited about the idea and began listing places she wanted to visit, while I tried to interpret the unreadable expression Dad carried for the rest of breakfast. The drive toward Portland felt longer than usual. Mom sat quietly with her hands folded, speaking only when necessary. Dad focused on the road with an intensity that suggested his thoughts were elsewhere. Meredith attempted small talk about her upcoming program, but her enthusiasm faded when Dad corrected a detail she mentioned. I watched her shift in her seat, uncertain whether to continue. The silence that followed pressed heavily on me. I could feel a distance growing inside the car, one that had nothing to do with the miles we covered. Halfway through the trip, Dad asked whether I had reviewed the material he gave me for summer study. His tone implied the answer would disappoint him even before I opened my mouth. I told him I had started reading it, though I was not sure I understood everything. He replied that effort without comprehension meant very little. Mom tried to soften the remark by saying I might improve if I remained consistent, yet even her voice carried a hint of resignation that stung more than criticism. A brief argument rose when Dad questioned my attitude toward personal growth. I attempted to explain my intentions, yet each sentence seemed to deepen his frustration. Meredith stepped in to suggest we take a break once we arrived, but her comment was brushed aside. Dad insisted that building resilience required removing excuses rather than entertaining them. When the car finally slowed beside the Portland bus station, I assumed we had stopped to stretch or grab something to drink. No one told me otherwise, and I had no reason to expect that this moment would divide my life into a before and an after so sharply that I would spend years trying to understand it. When the car finally stopped, I assumed we were only taking a short break before continuing the trip. I unbuckled my seatbelt with the thought that we might stretch our legs or look for something to drink. Dad stepped out without saying anything and opened the trunk while keeping his expression unreadable. I watched him pull out my small suitcase with a level of precision that felt rehearsed. Mom remained in the front seat with her eyes fixed forward as if any movement might reveal a truth she could not confront. Meredith stared at her hands while avoiding my attempts to meet her gaze. Dad set the suitcase near my feet and took a measured breath before speaking. His voice carried a firmness that left no space for misunderstanding. He said the words that would come to shape my entire adolescence with a clarity that cut deeper than any shout. Grow up and stop being a burden. I felt the ground shift beneath me in a slow, disorienting way as I tried to understand whether he had actually meant what I heard. I waited for someone to contradict him or soften the blow, yet neither Mom nor Meredith moved or spoke. Their stillness delivered the answer long before Dad turned back toward the driver's seat. The door closed, and the sound echoed through the space between us with a finality I felt in my chest. The car pulled away with a steady acceleration that confirmed I was not expected to follow. I watched the taillights disappear into the flow of traffic, while an unfamiliar quiet settled over me. I wanted to believe this was a mistake, yet every detail of the moment said otherwise. I stood there with my suitcase beside me, and a numb confusion that made it difficult to think about what should come next. As evening approached, I tried to find a place in the station where I could sit without drawing attention. My stomach tightened from hunger, although fear made it difficult to recognize the feeling. People moved in and out with their own lives and their own plans, none aware that I had just become a child without a destination. The hours passed slower than I believed possible. I tried to stay awake by focusing on the announcements, yet they provided no comfort. I had never imagined a moment where I would need to navigate the world without any connection to the people who brought me there. A security guard approached me after the final buses departed. He explained that the station could not allow anyone to remain in the waiting area after closing hours. His tone was professional rather than unkind, although hearing the instruction forced me to confront the reality that I no longer had a place to return to. I nodded because arguing would not help. He pointed toward the exit and waited until I gathered my suitcase. I stepped into the night air with no sense of direction, only the understanding that I needed to find shelter before the darkness deepened. I located a corner near the edge of the building where a small overhang provided minimal protection. I sat there while trying to steady my breathing and convince myself that I had enough strength to reach morning. The uncertainty felt overwhelming, yet I clung to the belief that surviving this night would prove I was not as fragile as Dad insisted. The next morning arrived with a hazy stillness that made every sound feel sharper than it should have. I sat on a cold bench near the entrance of the station while trying to understand how I was supposed to move through a world that had changed overnight. My suitcase rested beside my leg as the weight of exhaustion settled over me. I kept my eyes down because looking around required more strength than I had. My thoughts blended in a way that blurred the difference between fear and disbelief. A woman approached with careful steps that signaled both caution and genuine concern. She introduced herself with a warm yet professional tone that carried a hint of experience with situations far more complicated than mine. She said she was a volunteer counselor, Elise Kramer, and explained she often visited transit areas to check on unattended minors. Hearing someone speak directly to me with patience made something inside me unravel. She asked whether I had eaten or slept, and her voice held no judgment. I tried answering but could not keep my composure. Words dissolved into tears before I could form a coherent sentence. Elise waited without interrupting, giving me the space to regain enough calm to explain that my parents had driven away and left me there. She listened with an attention that felt unfamiliar. Once I finished, she contacted the authorities to report a stranded minor. I sat quietly while she made the call. When the official asked to speak with my parents, Elise placed the phone on speaker so I could hear what was being said. Mom insisted they had no idea where I was and claimed I had run off after causing trouble. Dad repeated the same story with a calm confidence that made it clear he believed the lie would protect him from consequences. Hearing them refer to me as a runaway pushed a fresh wave of disbelief through me. Elise exchanged a look with the officer that confirmed they recognized the inconsistency. They documented the conversation for the report. Shortly afterward, Elise accompanied me to a local shelter designated for abandoned or displaced youth. The staff asked several questions, although they kept their tone gentle. They offered food, water, and a place to rest. I answered as best as I could while trying to process the shift from being a child in a family to a child under the care of strangers. The transition felt abrupt, yet the kindness around me eased the fear that had taken root the previous night. During the following days, confusion remained, though its sharp edges softened. Elise visited regularly to check on my progress. She assured me that I would not face this situation alone and promised she would continue advocating for me. Her consistency became a steady point in a life that had been overturned without warning. A few years later, my life had begun moving in a direction I never expected. Entering a new high school felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory, yet I carried a quiet hope that I might finally build something resembling stability. I knew I needed a clean start, so I focused on my classes and tried to understand who I was beyond the version my parents had shaped. Teachers encouraged me to try new activities, and the freedom to explore gradually softened the weight I had carried since the day I was left behind in Portland. Elise continued checking on me through scheduled meetings, and her consistency helped me understand that structure could be comforting rather than restrictive. She introduced me to a small media workshop hosted by a youth program that specialized in creative development. I arrived without knowing what to expect, but soon realized that I felt drawn to the process of building narratives, editing audio, and shaping ideas into something coherent. Elise noticed how engaged I was and helped me apply for additional courses that supported my interest. Her patience never felt like pity, which made it easier for me to keep trying even when I doubted myself. By the time I was 18, I decided to pursue communication studies. Submitting my college application was an emotional moment because it represented a choice rooted entirely in my own identity rather than fear or pressure. Being accepted validated that choice, and although the excitement was real, the transition into college life demanded constant effort. I balanced part-time jobs with demanding coursework, and I used every opportunity to refine my storytelling techniques. College also brought me meaningful relationships, including one that would eventually shape my future in ways I could not have predicted. During a media production class, I met my husband, Sean Brady, who carried an effortless calm that made people feel understood. Working on group projects with Sean revealed how similarly we approached challenges, and our conversation slowly shifted from assignments to personal questions about the lives we wanted to build. His encouragement was gentle rather than forceful, which allowed me to open areas of myself that I had kept guarded. Sean became a steady companion in a phase of life where everything around me was changing at a relentless pace. After graduation, I accepted an entry-level job at a small communication firm. The pay was modest, yet the environment allowed me to observe how strategies were built and executed. I saved every possible dollar to gradually collect basic equipment so I could take freelance work during evenings and weekends. Those projects gave me space to experiment without the fear of failing publicly. Each step, no matter how small, helped me trust my judgment more. Eventually, I felt ready to open a small branding studio. The early years required long hours and relentless perseverance, yet I remained focused because I believed that effort had the power to change the direction of a life. Clients arrived slowly at first, then more consistently, as word spread about the quality of my work. Several magazines wrote short features about my journey, and although I never chased attention, seeing my story recognized proved that rebuilding a life was possible even without support from the people who were supposed to provide it. There came a moment when my work moved with a momentum that felt almost unreal, a shift so steady that each week reshaped what I believed my company could accomplish. I woke early, reviewed proposals before sunrise, then stepped into meetings that carried a level of expectation I once associated with people far more established than I had ever imagined myself to be. The weight of responsibility no longer frightened me, it centered me. Sean often told me that my focus unsettled him in the most admirable way, a comment that always made me pause because he understood precisely how hard-earned that focus had been. The company grew out of a modest office above a bakery, yet the space seemed to invite possibility rather than limitations. Clients arrived with complex problems, each one requiring a fresh angle, and I discovered a quiet thrill in finding solutions that felt both creative and decisive. Elise had once encouraged me to pursue communication work, and her early confidence created a foundation stronger than she ever realized. As our reputation expanded, larger clients followed. My small team transformed into a group of specialists who carried the same determination I brought to those early days. Their presence elevated every project, which pushed our results even higher. A well-known magazine reached out after one of our national campaigns surpassed expectations. The invitation to join their feature series surprised me, although I accepted it with calm curiosity. During the interview, I spoke about resilience without dramatizing it, because survival did not define me anymore. The article circulated within days. Inquiries multiplied. Conference organizers requested my perspective. Elise sent a brief message that read more like a quiet nod of pride than a celebration. Her restraint made the compliment feel sincere. 5 years into the company's journey, I purchased my first mansion. The structure sat high on a hill with clean architectural lines that reflected sunlight in a way that softened the entire property. The moment I stepped into the foyer, I felt a sense of permanence that no accolade had ever provided. The house symbolized stability, a home built by choice rather than necessity. Sean teased me for examining each room with meticulous precision, yet he recognized why every detail mattered. It was the first place where I felt entirely safe. During those years, Meredith contacted me a few times. Her messages remained polite, almost formal. She never pushed for closeness nor attempted to rewrite the past. I responded with the same distance. Not anger, not coldness, simply a boundary that protected what I had rebuilt. Our exchanges proved that two people could share blood while living on separate emotional continents. Whispers about Mom and Dad reached me in fragments. An acquaintance mentioned that their business had faltered. Someone else later hinted at debt. I listened to each detail without offering commentary. Detachment had become a quiet strength. Their struggles existed in a world I no longer inhabited, and I refused to let old wounds reopen through sympathy or resentment. Sean asked once whether I felt any satisfaction in seeing their downfall. I realized I felt nothing. Indifference had replaced bitterness. One quiet afternoon, I reviewed a proposal near the living room window. Sunlight filtered across the desk, creating a peaceful stillness that made the day feel weightless. My phone buzzed with a gate camera notification, something routine enough that I tapped the screen without much thought. The image that appeared erased the calm in an instant. Two figures stood at the iron gate, motionless, hesitant, familiar. Mom held her handbag tightly against her chest. Dad lowered his gaze as if preparing for a judgment he already expected. For several seconds, I simply observed them through the screen, unsure whether the sensation rising in my chest was disbelief or a distant echo of recognition. After 15 years, they had come to my door. When I stepped into the front yard, a strange stillness settled inside me, as if every part of my body recognized the moment long before my mind did. My father, Jeffrey, and my mother, Dawn, stood just outside the gate with postures that carried exhaustion rather than hostility. Their clothes looked worn, their shoulders drooped with the weight of something they had never shown me before, and their eyes searched my face for a softness they no longer had access to. Jeffrey lifted his hand in a hesitant greeting, yet the gesture held no confidence while Dawn clutched her purse as if bracing for an impact that had nothing to do with physical force. I unlocked the gate without stepping aside, allowing them to enter only far enough to speak. Jeffrey cleared his throat before saying the line they seemed to rehearse on the way over. "We're still family, aren't we?" The question landed oddly flat, as though the word family had never held meaning in their mouths. I held his gaze and answered with the only truth I felt. "Family, who are you?" Dawn flinched with a mixture of shock and disbelief, and Jeffrey tried to recover by rubbing the back of his neck and offering an explanation he believed would erase an entire childhood. He murmured that everything which happened years ago had been a misunderstanding shaped by stress confusion and circumstances they supposedly never intended. His voice wavered as he insisted they had always cared, yet the claim felt hollow when placed beside the memory of a bus station where I stood with a suitcase and no goodbye. Dawn attempted a gentler approach and said they had fallen on difficult times and only wanted a chance to reconnect. She implied that the past should remain untouched because people grow and learn, although she avoided acknowledging the deliberate cruelty that shaped my life long before I ever found stability. I listened long enough to understand that neither of them came with reflection or remorse. They came with need. I told them clearly that boundaries existed for a reason and that my life had taken years to rebuild after the day they drove away. I explained that I wished them safety and health, yet could not offer support or involvement. Their choices had consequences, and those consequences could not be rewritten simply because they now disliked the outcome. Jeffrey stepped back with an expression that mixed frustration and resignation, while Dawn's shoulders curled inward as though she finally realized the meaning of distance created by the very people who caused it. They exchanged a brief look before turning away, leaving the gate without attempting another plea. No final sentence was offered, no promise, no apology. They walked down the path in silence, and I watched until the figures that shaped my beginnings disappeared without looking back. Family boundaries protect the parts of us that once had no defense, and honoring those limits can determine the direction of an entire life. A parent's title carries no permission to harm, and a child's survival does not obligate reconciliation. Growth begins when we accept that some relationships cannot return to what they never truly were. Strength often comes from walking forward rather than reopening a door that once led to pain. Thank you for staying with me through the final chapter of this journey. I truly value the time you spent listening to every moment and reflection. If this story made you think about the boundaries within your own life, I invite you to share your thoughts below. What does family responsibility mean to you, and where should the line be drawn to protect your peace?